All right, so in this video, we're going to look at how to work with string data in Polars DataFrames. And again, this will kind of be extending our exposure to working with that kind of notion of expressions in Polars. So let's go ahead and get started. So I have got just some basic code up on the screen where I am importing pandas as PD, polars as PL, and then I am reading that store sales data into two data frames, a sales data PD, which is going to be a pandas data frame, and then our sales data PL, which is a polars data frame. All right, so let's look at the pandas version first. And let me just do head 3. All right, so in the Pandas Basics playlist, I had talked about working with string data, and in particular, I think I was working with this customer name column right here. In particular, we had made an assumption that, okay, they've got it written as maybe first name, last name, and that's just one big string, but maybe we want to have two separate columns, one that has the individual's first name and one that has the last name. And we just made the assumption that, okay, well, we're going to just split those strings on spaces, and that's going to give us the first and the last name. All right, so again, there might be some weird cases in there where that is not necessarily true, but we're going to make that assumption and we're going to go with it. All right, so how we did that is I can grab in this case, we're dealing with this customer name column. All right. And we can see that if I grab that column, that's returning a pandas series, right? So we have index labels, but no column labels. It's just returning a series. And we do get a name of that series, which corresponds to that original column name. And it's of type object. All right. And what we saw is that in pandas, okay, if I've got a series here and I want to do computations on a string, we know that Python has kind of a rich set of methods available to us for working with strings, like the strip, the split, the replace, all of those things. For example, if I say my string is equal to hello, so now I've got my string, which is a variable, and the type of that variable is a string, right? If I do my string and hit dot, we have access to all of these methods that we can use that can help us manipulate or transform that string. All right, and what we saw was in pandas, we could access a lot of those methods by going, okay, grabbing a series, in this case, a series that is of type object. It includes strings, and we can do a .str. My tab completion is actually working. Sometimes that's a little bit iffy when we're trying to access, or at least when we access columns as such. But it is working here, and we can see we've got a capitalize. We have a lot of those string methods that are available to us just using pandas, but we're having to use this accessor.str. All right. So what we had done to kind of get this first name, last name column is we said, well, we want to do a string, and then we'll do a dot split. All right. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to split on white space. All right, so we can see that that takes the values in that column, or in that series, I should say, and essentially giving us back what looks like a list, right? And if I actually did a dot loc here, right, and grab the 0th index, right, we can see that that is in fact a Python list where we've got that first name and then the last name. All right, well, this is somewhat helpful. So we see that we can split. But one thing that is kind of interesting, it's still returning a pandas series, right? So how do I get the first item of that and put it into a column of a data frame? Well, there's also in pandas implementation of string.split, it has an expand argument, and you can set that equal to true. And instead of returning, just a series with list in the entries of that series, now it's going to return to me a data frame, and we can actually see, maybe we're, one of our assumption, the assumption that it's always just going to be that split. So one of them apparently has 3 entries here, but nonetheless, right, we're still going to be, doing that assumption of, or maybe we don't even have to do that. Let's say that we're going to assume that this first is always going to be whatever's in this column 0 here is going to be the first name, and then maybe we'll combine what's in this 1 and 2 to make the last name, right? So maybe it's something like a van something, right? All right, so we're getting there. All right. So with in this case we've got the string, we can do a dot split, and now this is a pandas data frame, so I can say, well, give me back the 0th column, right? Because remember, when it does that split, it gives me back 3 columns in this case, 0, 1, and 2, and basically that's the fact that it has that column 2 means that it did that split on white space, and at least in one entry, when it did that split, that resulted in 3 different items. The majority of them, that value is equal to none. All right. And so what we could do is we could say, well, okay, well, I'm going to say, well, let's just grab the 0th. Okay. That could give me my first name. And then we could maybe, take the values from 1 to 2. So that's my first name. Let's do the same thing down below. Let's see if we can grab, let's say, a dot loc. So it's getting a little complicated right now, right? So we can say, well, give me all rows, give me 1, 2. Oh, dot loc. I've got to open that. There we go. And let's see if we can just somehow sum those across. Let's see. Let's do it the good old let's just grab 1, and then let's add that to 2. Let's see what happens for the entries where we have none. All right, so a little bit kind of, all right, so it doesn't like to do that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in that second column, again, it's getting kind of complex. And the reason it's giving me those NANs is because if you recall, when we do that split right here, we do that expand, a lot of those values are none. So it doesn't know how to add none to a string. So what I'm going to do is for that second column, I'm going to fill NA with just an empty string. There we go. All right, so this works. So I could do something like this then. I'm going to put that all together. And I'm going to make now a sales data first name column, and then a sales data last name. And that's actually this interesting expression. So I'm just using parentheses here to keep everything where I can do it multi-line where it's not so long. I'm taking those 1 and 2 columns, recognizing that sometimes we might have a none value there, filling that with an empty string. That way I can write them. And now when I do sales data.head 3, I've got 2 new columns at the end, one for the first name and one for the last name. All right, so we can, long story short here, we can use this .str accessor to access string methods in pandas, and then again, just depending on the complexity of the task that you're trying to do, which in ours this turned out to be, a little bit. We can use string methods to do operations on those strings to compute new columns, right? So this is be like a pandas implementation of trying to do that. All right, let's look at how we can do that in Polars, and I think there'll be a lot of interesting things to unpack here. All right, so again, we're wanting to work with this customer name column, and what we want to do is, again, we want to do that split. All right, so first thing, whenever we're trying to do computations on a column, so in the indexing video, we saw how we could do the filter on a data frame, and that was using that to essentially subset that data frame based on conditional statements. But in this case, we're actually wanting to do computations using one of those columns. So what we'll do is we have to use with columns. So that's kind of telling Polars, hey, within this block right here, within this with columns, I'm going to provide some expression syntax that will essentially define operations on columns. You could be overriding values in columns. You can be creating new columns. We'll kind of take a look at that. All right. And I am going to pull up real quick Polars documentation. All right. So if I go to their user guide, all right, so we're going to be dealing with expressions. All right. And if you notice, let's keep going down here. There is a string section in their documentation. All right. So what they show here is how you can work with string, and they've got a lot of different functions, right? So first off, we need to be able to access this string namespace, and notice that it looks very similar to what we had in pandas, right? So we use a .str to do that, okay? And then of course their documentation goes through some of their different methods, how can we replace, and whatnot. Let's see if they actually have a little bit more. I'm going to go to, let's see, I'm going to go to the API reference, and I'm going to go to Python. And I think this will be a little bit more specific, right? So let's go to expressions. And then, yeah, now I'm going to go down here to string, and this shows us all of the methods that we can use. So if we have a Polars expression, we can do a .str, and then we can do a concat or a contains or something like that. All right, so we can use those functions, and notice that we do have a .split right there, right? So we've definitely got a .split. One thing now that I'm kind of thinking about it, that we might want to do in our code when we, okay, so that was fine. We were just splitting on white space there, so that was going to be fine. All right, so what we need to do is we need to do an expression. So we'll do this PL call, and then we need to put in our expression syntax the column that we're going to be performing operations on, which is going to be our customer name. Right now, there is no change. Right? We don't get any new columns. Let me just keep putting head at the end. All right. So nothing's changed. And let me do head 3 so I don't have to keep scrolling. All right. All right. And what we want to do is we want to use that .str. Okay. And if I go back to that documentation, I need to just kind of keep that up right here on another window. I can drag that maybe back. So we're looking for a string .split. Okay. So a .split. And if we look at that, well, you can tell it what you want it to split by. And you notice right here that we don't have that expand argument. So we had expand when we were dealing with pandas, but we don't see that here. So let's do a string .split, and then we will do that here. All right, and now you notice in that customer name column, it's just overriding that, and it says, okay, well, now here is your split value for those two strings, right? Now, the interesting thing is notice that the type of the column has changed. It's no longer a string. It is a list of type string. All right, well, that's interesting, right? And one thing that I want to show you is that now if I go back to that documentation for Polars, notice that we also in our expressions area, we do have a list area. So in this case, our column is now a list, okay? So when we ran that, it returned, let me just close that guy. All right, so when we close that, it's returning a list, and we can actually do things off a list. So if we've got a column that is a list, we can, grab the first element, right? So if this is going to be like, notice in this example right here, we've got this column A, right? And it includes list of int 64. Right? Well, you call .list on that, and you can get the first element. All right, so what we just did returned a list. All right, so that returns a list. So I can now do a .list, and let's just see if we can index it. All right, so notice that just grabbed that first name. Right, so whatever the first entry was in that expand. All right. Interesting. Let's go back and let's look at this list again. Let's see, can we join elements of a list? All right, so can we actually slice it? Because what I would love to do is to say, okay, remember when we did that pandas operation, we had to recognize that, okay, it gave us back 3 columns, so we're going to assume that the last 2 should be combined to form the last name, like if there's some type of a compound last name. Well, if I can access the items as a list, can I just join them? Can I slice that list? Let's see what happens. So this technically, this expression right here is giving us our first name. And what we can do is we can assign that to a new column called first name by simply at the beginning of this expression, just saying, hey, first name equals. And now when we look out here to the far right, we see there's our first name, right? All right, so that was good. Let's see what we can do with our last name. All right, so for now, let's say last name equals, and let's just try some things. So we've got a list. I wonder if I can just slice from index position 1 all the way to the end of that list. It turns out we can't do this, right? Cannot create expression literal for value of type slice. So we're getting some type of an error. All right, let's go back to our Polars documentation here. All right, so here's our list methods. Let's see, is there anything? So there we've got a slice. All right, so with comms, we can do a list slice, and we could say starting points of the offset is going to be the start index. All right, well, okay, that might be interesting. And then we can specify a length. So instead of using this, we're slicing it kind of like a Python list, but maybe we have to do something like a slice. And then we say we're going to go from 1. And if you don't provide another argument, apparently it goes all the way to the end. So let's look at that. Well, that ran. That's nice. All right. And in this case, it's just grabbing that second part. And I'm assuming at some point, right, there's going to be a list in here that has at least 2 elements in it. And then, so that's a list. So now I can say, well, again, call those list methods. And if we were to look at that documentation one more time, I know I keep going back to the documentation, but that's purposeful, right? So we've got a list that returned. So list has a join method, and you give it the separator. All right, so I'm going to do a dot join here, and I'll just join those with a space. All right, so there we go. So that looks good. Now, if we think about this, so these are implementing the same things, right? So now if I were to say, okay, you know, here is my sales data. If I go all the way to the right, we could say there's Sean, Harold, all of those, right? So it is, we have got our first name and last name column. So here was the pandas implementation. Here was the Polars implementation. So again, key differences, right? So the first thing is, you know, with pandas, right, we're having to kind of, you know, we're grabbing that series and we're still using that string accessor, but you know, in this case, we had to kind of coerce it out to get a data frame, and we had to be a little bit clever here with this one because it ended up there must be at least some some name that had 3 distinct words in there, and we had to figure out how to access those and group them together. And again, it kind of gets confusing if you're you know, a reader, right? You're figuring out, okay, well, what's this expand thing doing? Because we're having to make a lot of different calls to that string.split.expand and whatnot. And then here's the Polars implementation. To me, again, we still have a little bit, you know, there's some things that aren't as clear as they absolutely could be, right? So we're basically saying, okay, well, you know, we're splitting on this, and then that's returning a list, and we're getting that 0th element, and we're doing this slice thing here. But overall, this is less code, right? And I do think it is still fairly readable, right? I actually think it's a little bit more readable than the pandas version. I am just going to do a real quick restart and clear all. All right, let's look at it from a computational perspective. All right, so let's do a time it on this pandas implementation. So these two things are, two pieces of code are achieving exactly the same thing in the two different libraries. So this is going to run a lot of different loops, right? So it ran 100 loops of 7 runs each. This took 3 milliseconds. And let's look at the Polars implementation. All right, so 420 microseconds here, right? So if you're doing that conversion, there's going to be, essentially 1,000 milliseconds in a microsecond. So the correct conversion, if we want to compare the Polars time to the pandas time, right? So the Polars code runs in, it only takes about 13% of the amount of time that it takes to do that pandas implementation. And again, I think it's definitely fewer lines of code here, and I do think it is maybe, arguably more readable, right? All right, so that's how we access string methods in Polar. So a few things that we learned here, whenever we're doing operations on columns, we need to use that with column syntax. All right, and then if we have a string column, so I'm setting up an expression here, and then I can use this string accessor to access string methods. And then even though it wasn't planned, we also saw that there's other types of accessors. So we've got a list accessor right here. We also will have some additional accessors that we will see later on. In particular, we'll see this temporal accessor, so that DT accessor. All right. We have a struct accessor if we had something like a dictionary. And then this isn't necessarily an accessor, but you can do windowing functions. All right, so that is going to conclude this video.